My name is Don Dickson, and I want to thank you for joining me again for another edition of our structure fishing workshop. Now, a couple of days ago, when we were winding up on our discussion on break lines, we were zeroing in on weed lines. And I meant to mention some other break lines that exist in the closing of that video, but I just flat out forgot to do it. So I'm going to have a short little video with you here today and mention these other break lines that do exist and the fish use. And I want to get it in your mind so you're aware of it. I want to pinpoint some of these break lines for you, even though it might not be something that you come across every day in your fishing. But if you end up doing a little bit of travel and you're fishing different types of lakes and different reservoirs, you're going to come on to some of these situations from time to time. So I want you to at least be aware of them. Now, what I'm talking about is what Buck always referred to as the invisible break lines. Not invisible to the fish, but kind of invisible to us. Now, I also realize that with today's new graphs, some of the products that are out there today may help clear some of these things up a bit for you. But these invisible break lines, what am I really talking about? I'm talking about where you have a bottom makeup that is dirty and then all of a sudden it's clean. The difference between the dirty area and the clean area creates a line. Fish can see it. And when that area travels for a distance, it is referred to, of course, as a break line. Fish can follow along it. Dirty bottom, clean bottom. It could be where you have a short moss growing. I ran into this with my old friend Danny Carpenter. We ran into this in a lake reservoir, actually, out in Texas, where it had a short moss growing all over the lake. I mean, it was pitiful. You couldn't present a lure without getting that little junk on it. And I said, I was about ready to give up with them. And I said, you know, we fished this little lake today just because it was in out of the wind, but man, you can't even present a lure in this lake. It's terrible. But we kept on, and it was getting about 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I said, you know, let's knock it off and go have a beer. I think I said that. At any rate, there was one little area that we hadn't fished. It was sort of out in the middle of the lake, but it was in the upper end of the lake or the reservoir. I said, okay, just to be sure, let's go fish this little spot next to the river channel. And the little channel wasn't but about 30 feet deep. And as I recall, it was breaking around 17 feet. And we try to fish this break line, you get that little moss on your lure. Finally clear it off and then get back down there again. And we hadn't gone but about 2 minutes in this area where all of a sudden our lure started hitting the bottom, no moss. Reminds me of the old prize fighter, no moss. At any rate, there was no moss all of a sudden. It was clean and it was sand bottom. It went from that little short moss to sand. And Danny's spoon plug didn't bump maybe 3 times and he hooked 7-pound bass. And the next time we get him on camera, I'll have him tell you what happened the rest of that time. There was a clean spot that wasn't more than 30 yards in length. Whole school of big bass sitting right there on a clean spot. We limited out, I think we had 17 fish. Biggest one 7 pounds, smallest probably 4.5. Clean spot. But it was a pure break line the fish could identify. I didn't see it, but I felt it. And many of these break lines will be the same situation. Proper presentation of lures, you'll be able to discover these areas. Now, it could also be gravel or rocks to a clay bottom. It could just be decayed vegetation like we have a lot of in Florida, muck. You could have shells and all of a sudden you got muck. And that line of separation creates a break line for the fish. By the way, I've come across that quite a bit in Lake Toho down near Orlando. Pretty famous bass lake. A lot of shell bottoms. Goes shell and then goes to muck. Shell to muck. And that creates this line of separation that the fish can see. We can't see it. That's why we refer to it as an invisible break line. I don't know, maybe on some of your new charts you can see it. I don't want to be contradicting something that maybe isn't exactly the way it is today. But you can always feel it. There's nothing like it. If your lure's on the bottom where it's supposed to be, you'll feel this difference. And when you establish that break line, you throw some markers, you'd be amazed how many times you're going to find a fish. It's especially in Florida now. I'm talking about shells to muck. But all of these break lines that we refer to as invisible, the fish can see them quite well, and they utilize them in their movements and migrations. Now let's talk about some of these other invisible break lines. First, let's consider this now. Some of these invisible break lines will occur on the vertical, while others will occur on the horizontal. Now at times, these different types can be related. And other times they're not. But some of the break lines that we're talking about would be color, temperature, oxygen, current, light. These are all examples of what we call invisible break lines. Okay, so I want you to be aware of these invisible break lines, how fish utilize them, and all of that. But in the overall picture of successful fishing, there's so much to talk about, so much to delve into. When we come to this invisible break line discussion, as I said, some can be seen and some cannot. But our interest, what I want your interest to be, is in the ones you can see, not the ones you cannot see. Are there going to be some of these break lines that the fish are using that you can't see? Yep. And the more proficient you get at your trolling and as you're feeling your lures and you're using the proper equipment, I'm going to assume that you're going to be using the proper equipment, you can feel these differences. Like out in Texas with Danny, as soon as we felt that clean bottom after fishing in that short moss all day long, I said, oh man, Danny, there's a clean spot. Bow! His rod just went off just like that, before I could almost get it out of my mouth. I'll have to tell you that story someday. And we sat there in 20 minutes, caught 17 big old hogs. And the first fish weighed 7 pounds. And it wasn't a very big stretch of clean water either. It was just one little clean area. Clay. Versus all that short moss, and there was all the fish sitting right there. Now, before we leave this, I feel like I have to at least spend a minute or two on the temperature and oxygen. These are, in fact, invisible break lines that do exist. However, in all of the different bodies of water, the content of the oxygen in one would be different than in another. The content of temperature and oxygen would be different in one from the other. And in sections of reservoirs can be different one from the other. And the quality and the quantity of the variables of temperature and oxygen and the combination of both, it's not worthy of our time and effort. It just isn't. I don't want you to worry about it. And by the way, I'll end with this. And of course, I'm slipping back into presentation of lures. But if we're controlling our depth and speed, all of these variables in temperature and oxygen and all of that, if we are thorough in controlling our depth and speed, we're going to catch fish. And we're not ever going to be too consumed about whether or not the fish has a bellyache or not. He's not feeling so good because the temperature's this or the oxygen's that. We don't care. Now, if it exists, great. But we're going to take care of it by controlling our depth and speed. So regardless, whatever section of water we're fishing, whatever the temperature, the oxygen combination is in that particular section of water, we're going to take care of that by controlling our depth and speed. We don't particularly care whether the fish has a bellyache or not. We're going to catch it. So even though that's a subject that the other guys like to talk about a lot, temperature, oxygen content, pH, all of that stuff. You hear about it all the time. They like to talk. That's the other guys like to talk about that stuff. We talk about controlling our depth and speed. And we'll take care of any of those temperature, oxygen problems that exist. We're going to take care of it by controlling our depth and speed. One thing I can promise you, and I'll end with this. You and I, we use structure as our guide to locating and catching fish. We do not use temperature and oxygen as our guide. End of story. All right. I'm glad I cleared that up. Next time we get together, we're going to be talking specifically about breaks and the importance they have in our fishing. And then after that discussion, we'll be moving on to weather and water conditions. And I appreciate you being here today. Hope you learned a little something. So with all that being said, thanks for being with me today. And I want you to like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram. And if you haven't already done it, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow along with us as we continue our structure fishing workshops, and we'll see you the next time.